It's my pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Steven Cooke. And in a sort of day of further connections, we just discovered that Steven knows my best man. So my best mate, who lives in Edinburgh and is a scholar of genocide, he was best man at my wedding. His daughter's my goddaughter, and it turns out that we have the mutual friend, so remarkable. Dr. Steven Cooke is an expert on Holocaust education and memory. He was, until June this year, CEO of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Any of you who've been through the museum in recent times will seen some of the remarkable work that happened under Steven's watch, some terrific exhibitions. Congratulations are in order, because last week he was appointed the new CEO of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. And I also just heard a whisper that he's been appointed to the board of the Duldig Studio as well. Is that? Which I hope I can publicly announce. But yeah. So it's my pleasure to welcome Steven. Thank you.
Thanks, Seamus. Hi, everybody. And yes, it's amazing the connections that connect us all, and we're learning more about that all the time. As Seamus says, I'm the former CEO of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum and a newly elected board member of the Duldig Studio. So I'd like to acknowledge my former colleagues from the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, and also my new colleagues at the studio, especially Eva de Jong Duldig and Anthony, fellow board members. So lovely to see you here too. Now, I am in no way, shape or form a scholar or historian of the Dunera or the Queen Mary, so it's more than a little bit intimidating to be standing in front of such a crowd of experts. It's been a privilege to work in Holocaust memory for over 30 years now, and the highlight of those 30 years has been meeting and working with Holocaust survivors, and by that, and I include, as is now widely accepted, all those whose lives were irrevocably disrupted by anti-Semitic racial ideologies and the actions of the Nazis and their collaborators. So this includes those who fled Nazi-occupied or controlled Europe before or during the war. And I want to thank all of you who have had the courage to share your experiences. And what I thought I would speak about today is the continued urgent need to remember the stories of the Dunera and the Queen Mary, and of this most difficult of periods, and then explore how we think about the ways in which memory can be propagated and shared in different ways, and particularly to explore the complexities of these experiences. And what I argue is that these stories overcome the distancing of time and space between our contemporary lives and the Holocaust to ask something of us in the present. In the Dunera Lives Profiles volume, one of whose authors is here today, they note that the story we tell offers a warning too, since as you read these words, war and violence rage somewhere in the world, and there someone is forcing men, women and children to flee their homes for an uncertain fate and an uncertain future. Their story is ours as well. Now, that book was published in 2020. 5 short years ago. And at that time, we could not possibly have imagined that in Australia, synagogues would be burned, anti-Semitic and far-right graffiti would be daubed in Melbourne and Sydney, including on Selwyn Street, where the Melbourne Holocaust Museum is located. So on the 85th anniversary of the arrival of the ships, and on the 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and a time when social cohesion is under threat, and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise on our streets and online, we need to redouble our efforts in the vital task of sharing and hearing about these experiences. So in the rest of the talk, I want to talk about the importance of conserving the places where these stories happened, and then about the stories themselves. Now, in 2021, I had the fortune to work with the Gandel Foundation and colleagues at Deakin University, including Andrew Singleton, another mutual friend, on the Gandel Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness in Australia survey. Now, what we found in that survey of over 3,000 adults in Australia, that general Holocaust knowledge was fairly good and comparable, if not better, than Holocaust knowledge in other places, such as the USA. For example, about 80% of Australians know that the Holocaust happened between 1933 and 45. Almost 7 out of 10 note the Holocaust refers to the genocide, mass murder of Jewish people. Some 63% correctly identified what a ghetto was, and just over 60% could correctly define the meaning of final solution. But when it came to Australian connections, the results were not so positive. 7% of those in the survey knew the fact, or the statistic, that Australia is home to arguably the highest per capita number of Holocaust survivors anywhere in the world outside Israel. Only 11% knew that at the Evian conference, Australia refused to accept more Jewish refugees. 16% knew that William Cooper was an Indigenous human rights activist who in 1938 protested to the German consulate in Melbourne against the treatment of the German Jews during the Kristallnacht pogrom. And 17% correctly identified that the Dunera arrived in Australia in 1940, carrying thousands of British deported enemy aliens, in quotes, many of whom were European Jews. So as a society, we know far less about our country's connections to the Holocaust than we do about the events in Europe themselves. And this is despite decades of writing, publishing, speaking, commemorating, and exhibition making. I wonder if the perception is still that the Holocaust was somebody else's story, that happened a long time ago and a long way away. And this has echoes of the literary critic George Steiner, and he reviewed the Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved in 1988, and he commented that, quotes, "No ash from the chimneys of Treblinka floated on an English wind. The Holocaust," he thought, "was seen as not our patch." Steiner was speaking about the distancing of the Holocaust from the history and the geography of British national identity. In this distancing, the Holocaust happened over there, back then. It happened on a diseased continent and had little to do with plucky little Britain standing alone against against insurmountable odds. Comforting national mythologies that allow us to ignore uncomfortable questions. To misquote George Steiner, no ash from the chimneys of Treblinka floated on an Australian wind either. Now, Steiner was, of course, correct in the literal sense, but the broader point is that this is perception rather than reality, and the way in which history is written. Because as we know, many of us in this room from first-hand experiences, there were numerous ways in which the Holocaust is intimately connected to the Australian story. It is both global and local, not so long ago, not so far away. So how might we encourage more people to engage with the complexities of these histories? The first, I argue, is an engagement with the sites themselves, the places where this history happened. We are the last generation who will have the privilege of hearing firsthand those who experienced the Holocaust and who came to make new lives in Australia. And so the places where these stories happened become arguably more important, how they are safeguarded, interpreted, and shared. Some recent work I've been doing through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, led by colleagues at Cambridge University, has developed a charter for the safeguarding of Holocaust sites. It acknowledged the threats to their conservation and strategies to protect them into the future. And we argue that this approach is also appropriate to the sites associated with the Dunera and the Queen Mary stories in Australia. Now, wonderful work is being done in many places, in Tatura, in Hay, and in the Victorian context, many sites are on the State Heritage List, including the No. 1 internment camp and the Tatura World War II internment and POW camps collection. And Camp No. 1 in particular is noted on the State Heritage Register for its rich archaeological potential. How can we make these places more visible, more legible? Apart from the Tatura Museum and collection, all these sites are on private land and mostly inaccessible, apart from the twice-yearly tours of Camp 1. What are the possibilities of further archaeological research? What new information may be recovered? What are the possibilities of digital reconstruction? Given the stunning artwork made in and about the camps, combined with military plans and details in archives, the opportunities to interpret the sites in new ways, incorporating stories in place, could provide vital new ways to engage with these difficult histories. And although there are more stories to be collected, more stories to be shared, we're privileged to have the archive that we do. Among many, many examples, I could note the Donera Lives books, Eva de Jong Duldig's Driftwood, and Melina Mockridge's edited volume on Slava Horowitz Duldig, Rezi Schwartzbauer's work on Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, Tony Eckfield's work on her family story, and as we've heard, the archival material that Paul and Simon noted earlier today in terms of their father. I also note the amazing work of the Lamb Library and the CEO, Merav Carmeli, in sharing these stories. Over 1,400 survivors have also given their testimony to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, guided by the late, great, much-missed Philip Maisel, a Holocaust survivor himself, who instituted an amazing campaign to record these stories before it was too late. And thank you to those who've shared their stories, and thank you to those who collect and disseminate them. They are stories we need to hear and act upon. We also need to acknowledge the complexities of these stories, and we need to highlight the connections between Australian history and geography. They are an intrinsic part of the Australian story, not so far away, not so long ago. And how we tell these stories is important, and I believe it's the role of cultural heritage, museums and memorials to unsettle. And I'll finish with two examples, one we tell in the museum and one that perhaps we should tell in the museum. Many of you will have been to the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne, an amazing, amazing institution. And in there, you'll see a glass case which contains a child-sized traditional Viennese jacket, a toy cartoon dog, and some letters. They tell the story of the Glazer family. The Glazers were Viennese Jews who, by the late 1930s, knew the writing was on the wall and needed to flee Austria. Family-assisted migration was a way out, and they knew they had a relative in Australia whose second name was Bora, but they didn't know the address, they didn't know any other details. So they wrote to all of the people they could find in Australia with the second name Bora. And the only person who wrote back wasn't a Bora, his name was Fred Ashworth, and he owned the Bora and White Ant Extermination Company. And the letter had come to him by mistake. But he got the letter translated, and moved by the family's plight, he used his connections to get the Glazers out of Vienna, and they found a new home in Australia. Fred heard their story and took action. The story not told in the museum is that of the entangled experiences of Marley Kohn and Argud Frixen. Marley lived with her family in Libau, Latvia, a life that was devastated by the German invasion. Marley survived the war, but almost the entirety of the Jewish community were murdered by the Nazis and Latvian collaborators. And the largest massacre, many of you will know, was at the nearby sand dunes, the beach. In her testimonies that my friend and colleague Donna Fries and I have studied, Marley talks about her new life in Australia, but the Holocaust is never far away. She is unable to join her family on that quintessential Australian pastime, a visit to the beach. And in her testimony, she talks about every nightmare being back. And this is a quote from her testimony. And they all came to my place, my friends and relatives, and they would go down to the beach and come back, and I wouldn't go with them. I would go to the park nearby and wait for them, but I never went down to the beach. I never went to holidays to the beach for a long time. The Holocaust stayed with Marley. Marley gave her testimony on at least 4 different occasions. I cannot share the testimony from the other Latvian from Liepāja, Argud Frickson. Like Marley, he came to Melbourne in the late 1940s and became a schoolteacher, like Marley. Unlike Marley, Fricksons never gave his testimony to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. He was a Latvian police officer and alleged Nazi collaborator, implicated in murdering Liepāja's Jewish community, including Marley's father. He died in 1990 as Australian authorities prepared to bring him to trial for his crimes. Later in life, Marley would find out that Fricksons, the person she held accountable for the murder of her father, was living a short taxi ride away from her in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Not so long ago, not so far away. So Marley, along with those who came on the Denier and Queen Mary, are just some of the tens of thousands of survivors who came to Australia before, during and after the war. It's the story of people who live in our streets, in our communities. It's both a global story and an intensely Australian story. So we need to continue to share these stories in different ways, in different places, and to share them in all their complexity, because it's an intimate part of our story with the ability to unsettle our comforting national mythologies. Given the results of the Gandel survey, we need to do more to help Australians understand those connections, and that despite, in Steiner's words, no ash from the chimneys of Treblinka floated on an Australian wind, the Holocaust is our patch. Thank you very much.